you're going to want to see time cards. You're going to want to talk to employees. You're going to want to see transportation records. You're going to want to see pay stubs. If you just have the 15-minute tour of the here you look out the window and you look over the floor and then you're in the boardroom and then you go out to dinner, you don't have any insight.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
For today, we are going to be talking about some of the challenges of an SME and dealing with like the forced labor regulations and legislation and all of that and whatnot. But Lila, why don't you introduce our guests and bring them on for us?
We do have a couple of service providers. What's one service provider, but a couple of guys from Harris Bricken, and we have Bob and Fred. We'll let them introduce themselves and give us a little bit of background. But welcome, guys. Thank you for coming on our show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you. So, Bob.
What's your background from your side of things?
Sure. I'm a customs and trade lawyer. I was in-house with Amazon Global Trade Legal for a little while, and then I went literally across the street to Harris Bricken with their Seattle office, where I do customs and trade work. One part of which involves, especially these days, a lot of forced labor emphasis. Helping particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. And I think going to what you were saying, Andy. This is, I think, some good perspective that we can bring because we work with these companies a lot, and they have their challenges. I'll never forget the first time I was working with a small fishing company out of Montana, fly fishing company, and the principals were their first question when this issue first came up in the context of a larger conversation about pre-importation compliance was, "What's a Uyghur? And how do you spell that?"
Yeah, it's like somebody's like, and it does not sound like it's spelled either, is it?
Right. I still have to double check the spelling sometimes. But that's just, I think that's emblematic of the world, you're entering when you're working with these SMEs, which just want to bring in fishing equipment. They don't, they're not thinking about Uyghurs and, Xinjiang Uyghur autonomous regions and things like that. So you're going to have some challenges. So, Fred?
Well, I guess you could say that I'm a China guy more than anything. That has really defined my career. I spent most of my adult life in China. I first went to China as a diplomat, and I ended up staying in China and in Greater China for more than a decade, working both as a lawyer and also in other settings that were not law firms. I went to Xinjiang in 2007. So this issue has a different resonance to me than it might to others. As part of my work in China, I visited a lot of factories in different industries all over the country. And during the course of that work, that was my first exposure to the issue of forced labor came about during those visits to factories. So when this, let's say, latest iteration of the forced labor issue, particularly in connection to Xinjiang, in summary, I come to this issue primarily because of that China experience. Most of my practice these days consists of intellectual property work, which of course also has important linkages to China. But because of that experience, working in China, working with American and other international companies doing business there, and the specific experience in with the manufacturing sector in the country, that all gives me a a different perspective, perhaps that is very useful in dealing with this issue.
I think the IPR work is interesting too. The USTR's recent Notorious Markets report specifically highlighted the forced labor element that's taking place in conjunction with these illegal markets, which are producing counterfeit goods. They don't really have an enforcement regime in place at USTR, but you can see this is on their radar.
And to add to what Bob is saying, one thing that we find is that bad actors typically do not limit their activities to one particular area. This is something that always came up in the context of IPR violations. The people who are selling drugs are also sometimes dipping their toes into counterfeiting or working with counterfeiters. And the same, when you look at the issue of forced labor, it shouldn't surprise anyone that there is some overlap between counterfeiting and counterfeiting and forced labor. Or you'll see the same thing with drug trafficking. You'll see the same thing with other criminal endeavors. You can utilize forced labor for pretty much any purpose, but for obvious reasons, illegal industries are going to be even more prone to have these issues.
Let me jump in here, though. It's like, all right, first off, and we were talking a lot about IPR, just for those our listeners that may be new to the thing, that's intellectual property rights. And so that's the scenario of when we're talking about counterfeiting, we're not talking about currency. We're talking about, let's say, a polo shirt, and somebody's going to use and knock off and make the equivalent of a copycat polo shirt, but it's not official polo. So that kind of stuff. So when you're looking at that, that's just one example. All right. From a SME perspective, and when I'm saying SME, I'm saying small, medium enterprises. So folks, when you hear that, that's what that means. What do we do? I mean, your day in, day out life where used to be, you could look and find a source, a distributor, anything like that, and say, hey, here's a good product I want to sell in my store, or I want to, buy and sell online, whatever, to other people, whatever the case may be. Now, as you're doing it, there are companies that their goods, when they're being imported, are getting seized because they come to find out it was manufactured with forced labor, or components thereof are of forced labor. How do you handle this? What would be some of the first things you ought to look at?
Well, I think put it in context to begin with. One, these things happen in one of two contexts. Either you're dealing with a client on the front end, as we've been fortunate enough to deal with clients on the front end where they're just starting up or they're just beginning to import. They might be brand new. That question, what's a Uyghur and how do you spell it? So you have the opportunity to educate them, orient them, and help them navigate the due diligence process that they should be going through. On the other context, of course, is they didn't do any of the above, and their goods they hit the port and they were detained, and now they've got 30 days, possibly subject to an extension or two, to do something about it. Good luck. Especially if you're a small and medium-sized enterprise or entity, because you usually don't have the resources and the leverage, especially at that late point in the ballgame, to do anything about it. CBP has a lot of good information out there about the things that you should be doing and how they want it packaged if you're gonna have to submit a package for an applicability review. I think the cooperation we're seeing, it to some extent, is a function of the hunger and the desire and the motivation on the part of the Chinese supplier to get his products into the United States market. That's desirable for them. I'm thinking of one product in particular that we've been this, really sexy product. It's very cutting edge. It's new. It'll do well. They're hungry. They want to get their products. So I see that they're cooperating more than another supplier I'm thinking of who doesn't have anything that's really state-of-the-art cutting edge, and they can sell to anybody, and they do sell to Walmarts and, everybody. And the cooperation's just been like pulling teeth. Well, you want a bill of material? You want us to fill out this questionnaire? You want us to certify this, that, and the other? You want to come visit and talk to people?
So coming back around, what would be some of the things that, again, I'm an SME, I'm just a small business guy, and what should I be looking at? If I'm looking at sourcing goods offshore, what would you recommend? How do I vet somebody? I don't even know. I'd say, hey, I'm new to this.
Well, one thing, so sort of following up on what you were saying, Andy, about the increasing costs of dealing with issues as they fester and become worse. I think responses are going to depend largely on where the SME is situated, both in terms of its activities and also its ongoing involvement with, let's say, China manufacturing. In the case of, let's say, in the case of a new entrant to the market that is in the process of looking for those sources, to be honest, and then sort of we're here, we're taking a bit of a step back and looking at the big picture. This is a time when I would say looking at alternatives other than China is something that businesses should be doing. It's not always going to be an option. I'll say that, right off the bat. But for a company that is looking at options and those options exist, then that right there is something that they need to be taking seriously and not just going for the lower price necessarily, because they have to take into account the possibility for other costs. And it's important to keep in mind that this is not just about forced labor. I first moved to China in 2005 when it was a very different environment. And it all boils down to this. Nobody was really exacting a price on foreign businesses back then for doing business with China, with all of its issues, right? Back then, the world, by and large, collectively turned a blind eye to a lot of things that were happening. Over time, that has changed, right? And we've seen how that led slowly but surely to the tariffs. And now we are seeing this issue with forced labor. And to be clear, this is the tariffs, forced labor, they are connected. You can go to our China law blog and find our comments on this from a couple of years ago, where we anticipated that forced labor would become the new tariffs. This was going to be the Biden administration's sort of evolution of tariffs.
With a lot to fit around the whole idea of a worker-centered trade policy.
Right. And without getting rid of tariffs. Right. So it's not as if it replaced tariffs. It complements them.
Yeah, there is more and more activity taking place, forced labor focused, and it's usually not Xinjiang specific. The EU proposal is global. The Canadian proposal is global. The Mexican proposition is global in effect, even though it's tied to, really, they had their domestic laws in place before USMCA, but, the USMCA obligates Canada and Mexico to implement regulations to enforce that. But there's a lot of variability around these different initiatives. And I don't know that they're as broad as we'd expect. Yeah, we've got Australia, we've got the UK, and to varying degrees. Australia, UK, the countries that you would expect, our normal, natural, traditional allies, right? But I don't know that we're getting the buy-in as broadly. It might kind of track what's happening in the sanction world with respect to Russia, where there are countries that are sitting on the fence. They're not doing anything at all. Or where they have started, like I think it's still in process in the EU. I don't think it's on the books yet. Canada and Mexico, as of May, they've got regulations and decrees in place. The Mexican one, when you look under the hood and kick the tires and look at how it works, it's incredibly watered down, incredibly deferential to the conclusions of the Chinese government as a point of departure. What's the Chinese government going to say? No, there's no forced labor here.
That underscores the political nature of all this. Although to point, this is a good moment to mention. Bob is saying, okay, look, you can't expect the Chinese government to be honest about whether forced labor is taking place or not. but actually, and I think this is one of the real complexities of this issue. Even though, of course, the Chinese government is trying to minimize the impact that all of this is having on trade, people might be surprised, but this is not exactly something that they're ashamed of. Now, of course, they wouldn't present this issue as, well, we're forcing people to work. Obviously, this is being couched in other language. We're modernizing one of our more backward regions. But there's a very high degree of official buy-in within China. So when people talk, for example, about, okay, we think that this is really going to start, this pressure that is being put on China now by an ever-growing coalition of other countries, they're going to start changing their tune. Again, they might look for ways to minimize the impact that this issue has on their exports. They see this as part of a process to modernize Xinjiang, to integrate the people of Xinjiang into larger Chinese society. And that in my view means that this is not going to go away anytime soon. And that's going to present a challenge to governments around the world. Because if this was the sort of issue, like, for example, with something like IP theft, I think there's greater hope that at some point the situation might improve, because ultimately Chinese companies themselves are going to be the beneficiaries of strengthened IP protection. But with this, because it is tied into these existential objectives for the Chinese government, I think it's a more complex issue. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Going back to the political leadership too, the thing that I would really hope for is that whether you're a senator or a representative or on a committee staff or a staffer, that there's some emphasis, some intent, some desire to strike a good balance between facilitating legitimate trade and not shutting down all trade in the engagements with especially for SMEs. SMEs account for approximately 40% of all imports that come from China into the United States. That's a big chunk. That if you were to really play this out to where it's headed in terms of SMEs and their ability to deal with these laws and the requirements of these laws and the due diligence. Because at the end of the day, the law doesn't discriminate. They're going to be held to the same standards and the same information. CBP will be looking at this, for the same inputs from an SME, from that small fly fishing company somewhere in the western part of the United States, as they would from Amazon or anybody else.
We talked with Anna, here I go again. Hisa. Golly, Anna is going to just beat me to a pulp the next time I see her face to face. I don't know why I have a hard time with her name, but she is one of the most highly respected folks out there, and I love her to death because she is so smart. She and I were talking, and we had her on just recently, and I threw this at her, and she was like, this was a good suggestion, is that, all right, you start vetting, you're going through, you start working out the deal, but at some point, let's say that you're a medium-sized company, and you've got people underneath you that are pulling things together, they're sourcing this out or whatever, but you're either the owner or a top-level executive or a high-level manager, whatever. At some point, it would be worth it to say, let me take what my staff's given us. They've vetted this one. They said, okay, fine. But literally take an expert and go. And don't go just on your own, because like you just said, Fred, I think you hit something rare. It's like somebody shows them a showroom, and I'm not the expert, so I'm not thinking to go, well, I should have asked, let me actually see the manufacturing facility. So if you've got an expert with you going, it's like, okay, we need to ask this. It's like, no, they're not. It's like, okay, now here's what you got. They're not willing to show the manufacturing. It's a nice showroom, but it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. Don't look behind the curtain there. The guy over there doesn't know what he's doing, kind of a thing. It's like, something's not right here.
The iceberg too, Andy. I mean, when you dig down into what the requirements are, what CBP is looking for, just in the UFLPA context, for example, in terms of documentation to demonstrate absence of attainment forced labor. You're going to want to see time cards. You're going to want to talk to employees. You're going to want to see transportation records. You're going to want to see pay stubs. If you just have the 15-minute tour of the here you look out the window and you look over the floor, and then you're in the boardroom, and then you go out to dinner, you don't have any insight. And then that's just at the tier one level. What's the statistic out there that you see all the time? 45% of supply chain managers don't have any visibility past tier one, where you could have potentially in tiers. CBP's looking for cradle to grave.
And to your point, you're right on the money. I come back to, and I think, Lalo, you were the one that brought this number up. There was an article, I believe, that you'd mentioned. There was if I'm not mistaken, $1 billion of goods seized under the forced labor prevention. And of that, there was only like 83 million that came directly from China. There was like 350 million from Malaysia and another 450 million from Vietnam, or vice versa, whatever the numbers were. But those were the Malaysia and Vietnam. Here's the point I'm trying to make, is that as you're looking through this, you may have a different source. So we've been focused on China, but here's something to think about. You need to go at some point with an expert. My source is in Malaysia. Okay, let's look at that. And that expert's going to help guide you to the questions. Ultimately, you as a business owner or an executive have the responsibility. So it's up to you to make sure that you have the right experts around you guiding you. And so you can say, okay, I want to know this. So now you empower that expert, or you empower your staff to ask the questions that need to be asked. And if you're not getting the answers back, or they're evasive, the old Lost in Space, the robot warning Will Robinson, and red flags go up. So all said and done, I would say take an expert. At some point, you got to put boots on the ground and go and look.
Absolutely. And that's a lot harder. I mean, it's a lot easier to say than it is to do, because you might get pushback on meetings.
Okay. So here's the thing that, all right, let's just say that there's some concerns, especially if you're on a trip. I'm one that, if my suggestion would be, and again, you guys can validate this, because I'm just common sense here, but it's like, if you're in the midst of touring a place, meeting with people, no matter where you're at, whether it's in China, Malaysia, Vietnam, Timbuktu, who knows, and you're beginning to pick up on some issues, you just need to keep your mouth shut, ask the questions, try and investigate it, make notes of that kind of stuff, if you will, whatever, but then don't make a big issue then. Get out of there, come back home, talk with your experts when you are in a secure environment, and then say, okay, there's something here, and look at it from that perspective, so that then you can go, it's like, all right, we need to, and maybe the right thing to do is like not necessarily make a big deal and say, well, I suspect there's forced labor going on. And it's like, you know what, as an executive, I don't support this particular source. Let's find another one. Or do you think it would be wise to say, here's my findings, and go through that?
No, you're spot on. I mean, this is definitely not something that you want to be addressing directly with someone in China. Make your findings, gather your information, get out, and then analyze. And to your point, one thing to keep in mind also is often the best strategy when you're looking for information is to pretend that you're looking for something else. This was something that we regularly did when we would carry out covert investigations of suspected counterfeiters, people that we suspected of making fake goods. If you show up at their factory and say, hey, we think you're making counterfeit goods, can we take a look? That's not going to get you anywhere. But for example, when you go in and you say, hey, we're here, we're sent by your supplier, by your customer, and we're conducting a social audit. That sort of triggers a different response. Like, oh, you're here to make sure that the toilets are clean and to make sure that we have a cafeteria. Sure, no problem. That creates a sort of different environment where you can perhaps have more access. Now, obviously, now with the forced labor issue, you do have to be a bit careful about saying you're there to conduct a social audit. But let's just, to give one example, then perhaps the tack has to be, look, I'm here because I have concerns over quality, so I want to make sure that I'm seeing everything. I want to see where you're keeping your materials. I want to see where you keep your finished goods. I want to see your loading areas. And again, your supplier might think, okay, this is going in a different direction. And as part of that process, you might be able to glean information that is useful. Now, that said, as you can imagine, a lot of people who run factories in China are pretty smart. It takes a lot of brains to succeed in that economy with all the competition there is. So people might be onto you. That's another possibility that has to be taken into account. But again, going back, yes, absolutely. Best to stay away, in my opinion, as a practical matter, from putting forth your concerns or your opinions that there might be forced labor issues, because at a minimum, that's just going to mean that meetings are going to end quickly, and that's it. So better to sort of go along, gather as much information as you can, and then take that back and sort of safely look at it. But yes, also keep in mind, this is a very sensitive issue, not just because of what I described earlier, the political importance of this. Also, the Chinese authorities, and we know this because of the laws they're passing, they're very concerned about foreigners coming in to snoop around. They're very concerned about Chinese companies helping foreigners get that information. So any sort of hint that you're looking at this is going potentially to make your hosts very nervous. So yeah, best to avoid bringing these issues up while you're in country.
Fred, on this issue, what are your thoughts about getting independent third-party auditors? Not you going in, but you sitting in your office in the United States and retaining a independent third-party auditor to go in this post-Minsk world, and in this world where the Chinese CCP is putting out these laws regarding anti-foreign sanctions cooperation and espionage. What are your thoughts on how viable a pathway that is? Because that was usually part of the playbook before that, integrating these provisions into your contract manufacturing agreements, doing your supply chain mapping and screening the UFLPA entity list, all these things. But, within that set of due diligence steps, you would usually try and work in that third-party auditor. What do you think now about that now?
Well, certainly the environment for conducting audits has become more complicated. I think the key for SMEs engaging in audits is to keep in mind the limitations of these audits, right? I think that in most cases it will be useful to get someone there. And
do you think you can in this operating environment now? I mean, it's even possible. Do you think you can? Do you think those auditors, objective and third-party auditors are there?
Well, Bob, I will say, Bob and Fred, I got to tell you, there are reports that I've heard that there are a lot of auditors that have been there. They're pulling up stakes and getting out because
that's exactly
of physical violence.
Yeah, this is kind of the new environment we're moving into post-Minsk, just this year.
Which means, right to your point, I mean, this is where I guess, Fred, to your very point is, if you're trying to vet somebody, trying to check things out, trying to look to see, and it's like you may even have an existing relationship in a factory going and they're producing something, and now you're coming as an SME going, I need to start verifying things, and now all of a sudden their answers are evasive or delayed or hostile or whatever the case may be. Don't ignore that and say, okay, are you ready to make a change yet? No. But you've got to now start taking steps to find something and say, I want to find another source.
That's reasonable care 101, Andy. I mean, that's what CBP says. If you see red flags, they say this is out there in the ICPs and the informed compliance publications. If you see a red flag, you can't ignore it. If you do, you're doing that in violation of your duty and your obligation of exercising reasonable care. We expect you to either work with that supplier to remediate the situation, whatever the issue is, and if it can't be remediated, cut bait and move on. And the challenge with that, and we had this actually with an SME that we were working with, where they wanted to do that. They were detecting red flags, and they knew that if they proceeded on the path they were on, it might not lead someplace they wanted to go. So the question became, the question of diversifying arose. Oh, well, there were other suppliers of this same equipment in Japan and South Korea. The problem, though, is that the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, if there are parts that originated in China and then ended up being assembled, so this law has a shadow, and it's going to follow you potentially. So you're still getting on the same hook to do the supply chain mapping and the screening and the questionnaires, and get your transactional documents airtight, but it's hard to avoid. Diversification can only go so far. In other words,
this at you. It's like, because one of the things being, again, proactive is one thing. I'm considering sourcing to XYZ company and in this location, whatever, and you start asking questions. There's another element where we're going is like, you've already got that relationship. You're seeing some red flags. So now the scenario is you want to start looking for other sources and get that ball rolling. However, one of the things that I would like your opinion on is, again, as a business owner, top, leader, whatever, would you think it would be wise to literally develop a strategic plan to change sources? And what I mean by that is something that in the event that something happens, you've got this strategic plan. You can come back to CBP to say, look, we started getting red flags. We see some things here going on. Here's what I've started asking questions. So we start looking for more sources, but here's the chain of events of my action plan. And so now I have a game plan here. So, look, you can't just cut me off here in this one particular source. I'm trying to find somebody else. Would that be good?
Let's back up for 1 second. When they repealed the consumptive demand clause under TIFTIA and forced labor through the WRO mechanisms, at least until the UFLPA came online, became a thing. And there were 53 some odd WROs, I think involving 11 countries ultimately. And then along comes UFLPA. It was a game changer. We, at that moment, I think really even with the repeal of the consumptive demand clause, we entered into a world where forced labor had not been, and really it wasn't a part of your pre-importation compliance planning. But at that moment in 2016, when TIFTIA came online and this, went away and this became an issue, the CBP and other agencies of the government realized, man, we can do something with this to further advance policy objectives. That changed. That was a game changer for companies, big, medium, small, everybody. So if you hadn't been focusing on forced labor in the way you should have, you needed to start doing it.
But also develop a relationship with a customs trade attorney firm so that they can give you some things. Would you not agree with some of those kinds of actions right there?
Absolutely, 100%. That's reasonable care 101. This forced labor issue, which we're talking about today, is just one item in a longer list of things that importers need to have the balls that they need to have their eye on, whether it's classification or getting the right country of origin. All these things are important in their own way. In many ways, sometimes they interconnect.
Well, folks, guys, this has been a fantastic conversation. We could keep on going. My brain is spinning, so I think we're going to wind up having more shows here because, Lala, I appreciate you getting this all set up for us because this is, my goodness, this is good. You guys, oh, man, you got such a depth of knowledge, and it's such a pleasure to talk with you both.
Well, we enjoyed having the opportunity to speak with you. And you're right, there's a lot more. I mean, we didn't even really get to the trends. When you look down the line, the immediate line, what's coming with forced labor, there's a lot going on there too.
Guys, what a sheer pleasure. You guys are so fantastic with what you've provided today. And I'm hoping our listeners definitely you take as I always say, a nugget of knowledge and or some actions that you can look at to take. And definitely you've provided that. So I think it's outstanding for today. Thank you so much. And Lalo, I will say that this is a fantastic show you got put together here. I think this is going to be one that people need to flag and come back and listen to several times.
Good deal. Well, thanks again for having us. We thoroughly enjoyed the experience, and I hope that we get to come back and talk to you about other subjects. There's no shortage of issues in the trade world, as we all know.
All right, to our listeners, you have a fantastic day, and keep us, please flag us, like us, share us, and thank you for your listenership. With that, you all have a good day.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.